Hi, and welcome back to Modern World History, where in this video we're going to continue our discussion on World War II. Now, in particular, this time around, we're looking at the aggressor nations invading. So, last time we talked a little bit about these things right here. So, we were looking at the idea that dictators, depression, fascism, all these different movements had occurred. People were already kind of left in a feeling of disillusionment due to the war itself and the catastrophe that followed. Much of the world was dirt poor during the 1920s, and the Great Depression occurs in the United States in 1929, which made the U.S. kind of, I guess, join the ranks in those who were extremely poor at a global scale. So last time we talked a little bit about those things. But all in all, it seemed as though perhaps democracy was failing. And many countries began to kind of abandon the idea that democracy was the answer to all of our questions. People started thinking that maybe the answer is actually going to lie in strong and decisive leadership, and only then can people expect the change that's going to lead to better lives. And so Japan was one of these countries that had begun to kind of move away a little bit during this time period from democracy. And I've got this little note here about organic theory, and I think last time we might have talked about this a little bit, but the organic theory was this idea that only by conquest and expansion can a country grow, and it grows in a way that's kind of mirrors a living organism. If you're not growing, then you're not eating enough, so to speak, and you start to starve and wither away. Well, keep that in mind, because what happens here is in the 1920s, Japan is a little bit more democratic than they had been, and they have a parliamentary system. Okay, but the problem here is that the balance of power is a little bit skewed, and the parliament's really the ones calling a lot of the shots here. The military answers directly to the emperor, and so they're kind of doing their own thing, and the government seems a little bit discombobulated. And so, coupled with the Great Depression, you start to see a lot of economic problems here, economic woes in Japan. And people, as soon as something starts to go wrong, they need someone to blame. And so they blame their parliamentary government. Now, the militarists, or those who were in charge of the military, they preferred more of a traditional governmental approach in Japan, where the emperor was the head and called all the shots. And what they did was they used this as an opportunity to take over the government, and rather than instill something completely new and different like Hitler and like Mussolini had done, they just simply restored the emperor, which kind of was a popular move. And so people kind of backed them and thought this was a pretty cool idea. And he was restored as the head of state. And so now the military, more or less, is in command of Japan. And so they go back here to this idea of organic theory. They start thinking, okay, so we're going to first and foremost solve the problems, the economic issues in Japan. And the way we're going to do this is to expand. And we're going to expand first by taking over Manchuria, which is a very rich industrial region here in China. All right, so the Japanese had already invested heavily into this region, and they thought this is going to answer a lot of our economic problems. If we can just control this, it can help our industries a lot. And so they go in there and just attack it. They just simply take it over. Okay. Now it's also important to note that these military leaders, they were super nationalists. And so when we're talking about nationalism here, like the fascists that we talked about in the last video, they uphold the well-being of their own nation. And when we talk about nation, remember we're talking about people that share a common history, a common territory, all right, and a common burden, maybe, all right. So and also language, also ethnicity, all these different things. So in Germany, you hear this talk about the Aryans, or the pure Germans is what that meant, and so that there's kind of the same idea of what's happening here with the nationalism in Japan. They will uphold the well-being of the Japanese at the expense of those that they conquer in this case. So the Japanese came in here and took over Manchuria. The military takes it so they can control the resources, as we just now said. And so the parliamentary system would have been like, no, let's not do this. They seem to be the problem here that led to all these economic issues in Japan. But the military was like, oh, well, I'm gonna do it anyway. We're gonna fix these problems. But just then, the League of Nations was all like, oh, no, she didn't, in terms of Japan going in and taking over Manchuria. So they said, you better check yourself. Then Japan was like, oh, I don't have to be here. So they up and left the League of Nations. So let's kind of summarize all that into what's actually happening here. The military in Japan takes over and gets rid of the parliament, restores the old system. Nationalism is all abuzz here in Japan. They start taking over territory, which is not something that they were supposed to be allowed to do, because it doesn't protect peace. It actually threatens the peace that the League of Nations is set out to protect. And when Japan did this, the League of Nations really did a whole bunch of nothing. They did nothing, right? They just simply said, "Oh, don't do this," and Japan left, right? And so the League of Nations, for this is really their first big challenge, right? I mean, the first time that any country just directly defied them, and they just don't even know really how to respond to it. They just let it happen, all right? Well, League of Nations lack of action was all the encouragement Hitler and Mussolini needed to start their own conquest in Europe. And so they did. And Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. Remember, Ethiopia was this country right here that was the only one during the scramble for Africa that remained a independent nation. Okay, so Mussolini also, by the way, they remained an independent nation because they defeated the Italians. And so Mussolini kind of wants revenge. He wants to redeem himself. He's got a way stronger military now. And so he goes in, invades Ethiopia, and conquers it. League of Nations did nothing. And so Hitler begins to militarize, even though the Treaty of Versailles specifically says that Hitler can't have, or that the Germans can't have a certain size military. They have to maintain very, very, very small military forces. And Europe did nothing. And so this right here is a really good graphic from your textbook that puts in a timeline all the different times throughout this period that Europeans and the League of Nations just sat back and let these things happen. And so this right here was Japan invading Manchuria in 1931. It wasn't but a few years later when you start to see Ethiopia and I guess the Italians and the Germans conquering Ethiopia and places nearby Germany, which included a large German presence, okay, such as Austria and the Sudetenland and all these different areas where Germans were. And so eventually, it just kind of gets out of control, and Europeans are just like, well, maybe they'll stop. Maybe they'll stop, right? It's like a crying kid. Maybe if you just leave them alone, maybe we'll stop. Or they start throwing toys. Maybe you just let them do that. They'll just stop, And the next thing you know, it's just a straight up policy of appeasement, all right? And that right there is what's happening here. So Britain, France, League of Nations, nobody did anything to stop this. They thought that if they gave in, Hitler and Mussolini would eventually be satisfied with where they were, and they would just up and stop their conquest. But we now know that really didn't happen. In fact, this right here encouraged them to continue conquest. Okay? It encouraged them to continue because they knew good and well that no matter what they did, they weren't going to be stopped by the League of Nations. And so Hitler and Mussolini, they fused together. They had this bromance, and they become the Axis powers. All right. And meanwhile, in the West, the United States is sitting here doing this right here. They're like, this isn't our thing. We don't care. We're just going to sit here and play Fortnite and eat whatever, chips and dip or whatever it is we have here. And so they're just not so concerned about what's going on in the world. They're trying to figure out the answer to their own economic problems at the time. They're isolationists, all right? So the United States is not going to get involved. Not our problem. Don't get involved. We don't care about what happens over that way. So you would think after World War I, maybe the I guess general attitude towards isolationism would have been different, but it really wasn't, because remember, We were still in the Great Depression here. People were trying to pick up the pieces that they had lost in the late 1920s, early 1930s. So Hitler declares in 1937 the Third Reich, and he annexed Austria. Now this right here is a kind of an alliance that they called Anschluss. Okay, and what that means is that one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles had prohibited was this alliance between Austria and Germany. Both countries here consist of German speakers. All right, and so when Hitler goes in, he annexes Austria. That was another direct defiance towards the Treaty of Versailles. Another example, by the way, of trying to take more land. This land, it kind of validates their belief in the organic theory, the organic system. Okay, that we talked about earlier in this, and also this is an example of what we would call in geography irredentism. Okay, that was a terrible arrow, but irredentism is the idea that if the Sudetenland contains German-speaking people, then it should be part of Germany. They feel very strongly connected to that territory, and therefore they felt like it's their destiny, more or less, to kind of go in and occupy that. And so the Sudetenland is this little region right here that actually was part of Czechoslovakia, but had a large German minority. And so the Germans went in there and took it. And there was another example of direct defiance. Eventually, they're going to straight up take Czechoslovakia. And all these different things here were going to be allowed at the Munich conference, which was a conference where this guy, Neville Chamberlain, comes together. He was the British Prime Minister. He comes together with Germany and just kind of establishes this, really solidified his appeasement policy. Let Germany had everything that they had. Everything they have done to this point was validated and was made okay. And he comes back talking about, you can go on YouTube and see it, peace in our time. Okay, he considered this a big victory. We're going to have peace because, hey man, Hitler's done. We appeased that guy. The temper tantrum is over with. The kids stopped crying. We have victory. Awesome. But as we know, this could not be further from the reality of the situation. Things are going to get even worse. We'll talk about it in the next video. Thanks for watching.